welcome to the Different Sides of Learning. My name is Shakira Rouse, creator and founder of Special Compass, an organization dedicated to helping students with learning disabilities achieve success inside and outside the classroom. Today, I wanted to take a moment and sit down with the community, the people that help support students with learning disabilities. And today I'm very pleased to have a psychologist, Fiana Andrews, sit down with me and share with us a little bit more about her process and journey to becoming a psychologist and how her work helps students with learning disabilities achieve success. So good day. Hello, Fiana. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Yeah, great. So let's just dive right in. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey, about how you became a psychologist and what interests you into working with the demographic of students that you work with?
All right. So I always wanted to help others and I always wanted to understand the mind. Originally, I was going in the route of social work, but for my undergrad, I took a program that kind of introduces you to social work, behavioral social work, sociology, and psychology. And the program was called behavioral science. I ended up liking psychology a little bit more than social work. So I decided to go down that route for my master's. I applied to a school psychology program, and that kind of led me into school psychology. And with that program, I was able to work specifically with children and adolescents in the school environment. And I'm currently working full time for the Peel District School Board as a school psychologist there. And I also do part-time work at it's a private clinic.
Cool. That's very interesting because a lot of the time I work with students, not only individuals, but I do a lot of group sessions, especially with teenagers, I should say, going to post-secondary. And one of the things I really stress and talk about is that a lot of the times we hear certain professions like psychologist, doctor, engineer, and a lot of the times these students don't understand what is that pathway to get there. And even if you want to go into psychology, for example, there's many different branches of psychology you could specialize and focus in. So thank you so much for sharing that journey. I think that's actually a very important lesson for a lot of people. So you talk about educational psychology and kind of like getting the schools. So do you want to talk a little bit more exactly what it is that you do with in terms of educational assessments and that within the school?
Okay, so there is a slight difference between an educational assessment and a psychoeducational assessment. An educational assessment is just looking specifically at academics only, but a psychoeducational assessment is more comprehensive and it includes intelligence tests, academic tests, socio-emotional tests. You're also doing observations. You're also gathering interviews and interviewing parents, teachers, the student, reviewing reports like report cards and past assessment reports. And then after you gather all that information, you come up with a formulation or a reason as to why that student is struggling in the school environment.
Okay, so let's take it a little bit back if we can for a second, because I know that a lot of parents come to me and they say, the school suspects that my son or daughter has a learning disability. What is the next step? And I always say, okay, well, you have to get a diagnosis confirmed, get a psychoeducational assessment done. And I think sometimes people don't understand the whole process and the journey it takes to get the child support. So let's say from when you meet a parent and they initiate this, like, hey, we need to get an assessment done, what is the length of that process?
Okay. So the process in the school environment is a little bit different to the process of if you were to seek a private assessment. So I'll start with the school environment situation. So it starts off with the teacher or even the parent who notices that their child is struggling with their academics, whether it be learning or maybe they're exhibiting behaviors that's preventing them from being successful in the school environment. So once that's noticed, the child is then presented at what's called a school team meeting. It's called different names at different school boards. At the Peel District School Board, it's called the In-School Review Committee meeting. And I believe it's called other names at other different school boards. And at that meeting, the teacher would present the student and the needs that they're presenting in the classroom. And a part of the committee includes the psychologist, the speech and language pathologist, the social worker, we have the special education teacher, we have what's called a CERT, the special education resource teacher, who's a representative of the board. We also have principal, vice principal sometimes, and any other person that may be helpful in providing information. Sometimes the behavioral teacher might be a part of the conversation as well. At that meeting, the needs are presented, and then we offer recommendations. The recommendation is not always to start off with a psych assessment, especially if it's the first time that they're presented at that team meeting. They want to try different types of strategies first to see if they respond well to those strategies. And if they continue to struggle, then they would be referred to an assessment just to understand more about their learning. Once they're referred, sometimes they're not tested right away because they go based on priority. So the student who has the most needs would be assessed first, and then eventually they would be assessed. The timeline varies based on the needs of the school. So how many students they have, how many students require support. Students who would benefit more from a smaller class would be chosen for assessment before somebody who's getting the support that they need within the regular classroom, because the smaller classes require an assessment to be in those classes. So that's why they would be prioritized over a student who would most likely stay in the regular classroom. So because of all those factors, the timelines may extend when a student actually gets assessed. So if you have a child, as a parent who has a child whose needs aren't that significant, but you want your assessment to be done more quickly, you would get the private assessment, because that would most likely be done faster than if you were to wait until your child is prioritized in the school board. So if you go privately, the timeline is faster. You could call around to see who has the availability, because sometimes they're booked and then you have to wait in order to get assessed. But then if you call around and find that the availability is sooner, you can get your assessment done within that same month of calling somebody, depending on the availability. And once you get that started and the assessment is on its way, then it takes about 2 to 4 weeks generally to complete the assessment from start to finish, from when you make the call and from when you get the report in your hand.
Okay.
So why it takes 2 to 4 weeks, it depends on like what you're the question that you're answering. If it's a gifted assessment, those are faster than a more thorough assessment, which would include academics and socio-emotional assessments, because that requires more testing time and more reviewing time as well.
That's good to know. I didn't know about all of that process. I had a general idea, but I didn't realize that, especially about depending on what you're trying to assess, there's going to be different kinds of questions. So that, I think that's really helpful to know, because I do know that I think some people think that this is okay, something that just happens over 2 weeks and then we'll get help and everything's going to be okay. But they need to understand that it's more of a lengthy process than many people may realize. But, and like I said, and I guess that's the whole part of why we're doing this conversation is that it takes a team of people to support this child, and there's a lot of things that go into it, and I want everyone to understand that.
Add a little bit more to the process.
Yeah.
So after you get the report, the process doesn't necessarily stop there. So if you get it done privately, you would have to bring that report to the school especially if there's a diagnosis. If you want the support to be finalized and formalized, you would give the report to the principal so that the student would be presented at the school team meeting again, and then the referral recommendation would most likely be to identify the student as a student with special needs, and then they would refer that student to the IPRC committee, which is the Identification Placement Review Committee, to formally identify the student as a student with special needs. And if it's a learning disability, the identification would be learning disability. And then if it's in the school, same thing, they would be identified through the IPRC. Once the school psychologist finishes the report, they review the report with parents in school, and then review it with the team, and then refer the student again to the IPRC. And parents are invited to that meeting at the IPRC to be a part of that meeting.
Right. And then at that point, once the IPRC has identified the student as, let's say, having a learning disability, that's when they get into the process of implementing, let's say, an IEP.
Yeah.
And to help to get that student like support and within their academics in the classroom. So yeah, that's a pretty intense process.
Yeah, and you can do the IEP without being formally identified. The school has the right to implement IEPs even without a formal diagnosis. So if the student benefits from accommodations or even modifications, that could be done without a formal identification.
Can that be done without parents' consent?
Technically, it can.
Okay.
However, parents could be adamant, because I've seen situations where parents are adamant about it and they get their request honored, but they can implement IEPs without parent consent.
Okay. Because yeah, I've had situations too where parents are that the one was implemented without their consent and parents were upset. So I wasn't too sure about that whole process. And I know that unfortunately, there is a lot of stigma associated with IEPs and sometimes even learning disabilities in general that prevent people from getting the access they need, or they're probably not open to speak up and advocate for themselves, or speak up for them. So essentially, this is exactly why I do what I do, because once upon a time I was that student, and I been through the system. I've seen how things work, and I see that my personally downfall was not being able to advocate for myself in university and not understanding what my learning disability was. So I was able to advocate and implement more effective strategies in my education to help me. So yeah, that's a kind of, I guess, big circle about like how I'm here today and why I do the things I do with Special Compass. But I wanted to kind of go back and touch back on that assessment, because I've heard a couple of times where, let's say if a parent's suspecting something, let's say the kid's maybe 8, and then someone in the school, or I shouldn't say in the school, but someone may suggest to them that maybe we should wait a little bit until they're older, until they're I guess they're, I don't want to say they're saying that the brain matures a little bit more, but just to see if they grow out of certain things before we do an assessment. So my question for you is does it matter what age you do an assessment? So if you do a psycho assessment, let's say when you're in grade 5, I guess you're like 11 at that time, will it differ from if you do it when you're 18?
That's a good question. When it comes to learning disability, One of the things that meets the criteria for a learning disability is to show a discrepancy between the academics and their abilities. So a learning disability, or someone who has a learning disability, has average to above average intelligence. And then if their academics is not meeting that potential, because you expect their academics to be at average as well. If they're average intelligence, their academics should be average. But if their academics is below average, then we want to assess why. And sometimes it ends up being a learning disability as to why they're not meeting their expectations. However, when you're younger, like a kindergarten kid, for example, it's hard to see that discrepancy at that age. It doesn't mean that they don't have the learning disability, but to see that discrepancy at that age, it's generally small at that age.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes because of that, sometimes we wait until they're like maybe grade 3 when you are able to see that discrepancy. However, supports and an intervention doesn't need to wait. Yes, meant to wait, but intervention shouldn't wait. Intervention should start as soon as you see that the child is having difficulties. So if you see that they're having reading difficulties, start intervening right away. You don't have to wait for an assessment and a diagnosis to determine that they have a learning disability to start intervening on their weaknesses. So I would recommend the earlier, the better with regards to intervention, because that would help that child as quickly as you can to help them is the better for them to succeed and not to wait to intervene.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for saying that. There's a lot of really good gems in what you just said right now. So the kind of even just like ties into my next question, because you said that people with learning disabilities, they have average to above average intelligence. But I know that there is a lot of, like I said, stigma associated, not just with learning disabilities, but other exceptionalities in general, or just being placed or identified as a special needs student. There's a lot of stigma associated with that. So what is one, I guess, what is something you could tell us in addition to help debunk this stigma and to kind of bring truth to, I guess, for individuals learning disabilities? What are some facts that something that many people are unaware of?
Yeah, so I guess the first one would be that a learning disability doesn't mean that you're not smart. I think that's the most important one to know, because a lot of times people think, okay, if I have a learning disability, that means I'm not smart, and that's not true. Because to have a learning disability, you have to have average to above average intelligence. So that means you are capable of learning, and you shouldn't be considered as not smart. For parents who have or even students who have the fear of um, being labeled is kind of like inevitable, because you could either be labeled as a learning disability student or you could be labeled as lazy. Which one is better? I would say the learning disability versus the lazy label, because the learning disability shows that you are capable of learning, you just learn differently. So why not find the answer as to why you're struggling academically? It's not because you're lazy, it's because you learn differently. And somebody who finds that answer should feel empowered and not disempowered. Another thing to talk about too is from parents, they worry that if I have, as my child has a learning disability, they're not going to be able to go to university. That's a lie too, because you are able to go to university. You are not discriminated against because you have a learning disability. In fact, you are at an advantage, I would say, because you are able to get supports there. If you need to require a longer time to do an assessment, for example, when everybody else has an hour, you could have 2 hours. And I think that's an advantage, not a disadvantage. So I guess those are just a few that come to mind quickly of some.
Those those are great tips. Those are great tips. And yeah, you can go to the university or college, post-secondary, finish whatever level you want to with a learning disability. That's like actually like the biggest message that I want people to realize, that you're not limited in life because of a learning disability or because of any kind of exceptionality. So thank you so much for um, reinforcing that message. And I never thought about that. Like, yeah, labels are kind of like, we can't really get away with them because we're always going to be labeled something. But what do you rather be labeled as, lazy or having a learning disability? And you're right, it is empowering. And I think we need to um, be, I think we just also need to be not afraid of these labels, and be, and I think it's time that we just, like we said, like disempower those stigmas and what those negative associations, and be more empowering with everything. So thank you. So also another question, my last question actually, is because we're in an interesting time period right now, and there's a lot of talks about, let's say, people being want to support and being allies to different people. How can someone be a support or an ally for someone that has a learning disability? So whether you're a parent or maybe another student that has a friend, then they just want to be a good support to them.
Sure. So um, advocating on their behalf, especially if they're young and not able to do it yet, is a good way to support somebody who has a learning disability, especially if you're a parent. You can make sure that they have the supports in place, make sure you understand the IEP. And if you're not able to um, read it or understand it right away, ask for help to understand it, whether it be through the school. And I guess they could come to you too, right, to understand the
Yes,
IEP.
yeah.
Yeah, so getting, or even myself, you could ask a psychologist to help you understand the IEP, because you want to be able to make sure that the teachers working with your child is working towards those goals. If they're not working towards those goals and they're not doing those strategies that are outlined on the IEP, and you're not seeing improvements, sometimes it's because they're not even doing the strategies. So you need to like make sure that they are doing the strategies that are outlined in the IEP, so that you could see improvements in your child's learning, and supporting them in that way, and advocating for them when they're not able to do it themselves. And also, if when it comes to those myths, helping to share that message to others too, that your child's not lazy, your child just learns differently, your child is capable of learning, your child is smart, and even teaching that to your child too is always to help support your child and be an ally for them.
Awesome. That's a great message and a great way to end this interview. So I want to say thank you one more time again for taking the time to just join us today and just sharing this, your experience and your journey as a psychologist, and helping us to be more enlightened on the different sides of learning and what it takes to help support a student with learning disability for success. So before we close, I just want to know any final thoughts you want to share with our guests, or if anyone's listening and wants to reach out to you, how can they contact you?
Sure. So my website is fianapatriceconsulting.com. So you can contact me through there. I'm also on Psychology Today. So if you search for my name on Psychology Today, you can contact me through there as well. I also work part-time for CBM Psychological and Counseling Services located in Pickering. So I do counseling and psychoeducational assessments through them as well. And then if you're a Peel student or have a child in the Peel Division School Board, you can look for me there too, and I could direct you to the psych for your child's school.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Fiona, for joining us today on the different sides of learning. It was a pleasure learning about your work as a psychologist and again, how you help students achieve success. So thank you to those tuning in and listening, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of the different sides of learning.
Thanks for having me.